Dear friends, today we are going to be talking about some big ideas and some big words. Now, I'm not typically the kind of person who uses big words, medium-sized words definitely, but big words, words like anti-disestablishmentarianism or sesquipedalianism, which means the tendency to use long words. Definitely not. But I am interested in the two words that Mary Baker Eddy called the largest words in the vocabulary of thought. And they are Christian and science. Now let's think about that for a moment. Linguists estimate that there are more than 1 million words in the English language alone. And here is Mrs. Eddy describing these two words as the largest, not just in the English vocabulary, but in an even larger vocabulary, the vocabulary of thought. Think of what that means. It means that every day, when you read the Christian Science Bible lesson, or the Christian Science Journal and Sentinel, or the Christian Science Monitor, every time you attend a church service or a Wednesday testimony meeting, every time you read and pray and ponder the Bible and science and health with key to the scriptures, you are considering the two largest words in the vocabulary of thought. As students of this science, that is what you are entertaining continually. Now, after Mrs. Eddy identifies these words as the two largest in the vocabulary of thought, she writes, the former, and that's the Christian, is the highest style of man. The latter, and that is science, reveals and interprets God and man. Now, for our purposes today, I would like to switch the order in which we discuss these words. I would like to talk about the science of Christianity, because elsewhere in Science and Health, Mrs. Eddy says, science will declare God aright, and Christianity will demonstrate this declaration and its divine principle, making mankind better, physically, morally, and spiritually. So it's science that declares God aright, that reveals and interprets God and man, and then Christianity demonstrates this declaration and its divine principle. Christianity expresses the highest style of man. It makes mankind better, physically, morally, and spiritually. So you see, we can't have Christianity without science, because science is the underlying principle, and Christianity is the natural outcome of understanding that principle. There's always an outcome, isn't there? And there has to be, because God doesn't exist in a vacuum. God is inextricably linked to his expression, man. And this is what science reveals and interprets, God and man. Infinite mind cannot exist without its infinite manifestation. Infinite life would not be life if it weren't expressed in being, and divine love must be reflected in love. So it is with divine science. It is made evident in health. In other words, physical, moral, and spiritual redemption. Interestingly, the marginal heading for the paragraph in which Mrs. Eddy discusses this science and its effect reads, mankind redeemed. Mankind, that's all of us. Now, how does this work? What does physical, moral, and spiritual redemption look like? What is the effect of this science when understood? Fortunately, we have many powerful examples to draw from in the Bible, starting in Genesis and appearing all the way through Revelation. But today, I would like to look at the hardest cases, at the individuals who appear to have the longest road to travel toward redemption, and whose natures were so dramatically transformed that for all intents and purposes they became different people. The three men I would like to consider were criminals, and they had all committed what is generally considered to be the worst crime of all: murder. The first is Moses, whom we know killed an Egyptian guard who had beaten a Hebrew slave. He fled Egypt when the ruling Pharaoh learned about the crime and tried to have Moses executed. So in other words, Moses was a fugitive from justice. The second man is David, who not only used his power as king to seduce the beautiful Bathsheba, but also to send her husband into the front line of battle to be killed. And finally, the third man I'd like to discuss is Paul, who as a Pharisee made it his mission to persecute Christians beyond measure. And we know he admitted to being present at and consenting to the stoning to death of one Christian in particular, Stephen. And yet, despite these brutal crimes, where did these men end up? Well, these are the men who wrote the Ten Commandments, most of the Psalms, and a substantial portion of the New Testament. These three men became spiritual pillars of the Bible. So, what happened? How did men who had committed such horrible crimes change so dramatically into the great spiritual leaders of their day? How were they transformed into the highest style of man? How did they emerge from such deep darkness into such profound spiritual light? That, my friends, is the subject of our discussion today: emergence into light. In Mary Baker Eddy's autobiography, Retrospection and Introspection, she writes under the heading, Emergence into Light, that she was waiting and watching when the light came, when the character of the Christ was illuminated. She saw the true nature of God and man, perceived that being was beautiful. Its substance, cause, and currents were God and his idea. She had, she writes, touched the hem of Christian science. The full radiance of the Christ transformed Mrs. Eddy as a glimpse of it had transformed Moses, David, and Paul. For we know that when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments, the skin of his face shone. Paul was literally blinded by a light from heaven on his journey to Damascus, and David, in psalm after psalm, speaks of spiritual illumination. The Lord is my light and my salvation, he writes, for in thy light shall we see light. Unto the upright, he says, there ariseth light in the darkness. Clearly, this was a man who knew something about the light of God. Light characterized the life of Christ Jesus from the start, from the star that heralded his birth to his transfiguration, in which his face did shine as the sun, to his eventual resurrection and ascension. I am the light of the world, Jesus said. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. But this Christly light did not begin with Jesus, as Mrs. Eddy notes. The advent of Jesus of Nazareth marked the first century of the Christian era, but the Christ is without beginning of years or end of days. Throughout all generations, both before and after the Christian era, the Christ, as the spiritual idea, the reflection of God, has come with some measure of power and grace to all prepared to receive Christ truth. Abraham, Jacob, Moses, and the prophets caught glorious glimpses of the Messiah, or Christ, which baptized these seers in the divine nature, the essence of love. Spiritual illumination in the Bible begins in Genesis, where God says, "Let there be light," and there was light. What is this light, this Christ? It's the Word of God, of truth. The revelation of divine science, which brings to light truth and its supremacy, universal harmony, the entireness of God, good, and the nothingness of evil. To emerge into the light is to see what already is. The illumination of spiritual sense doesn't create anything. It reveals the already present, the always present reality of being. As John tells us, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." The Word of God, whom Mrs. Eddy defines as the great I Am, the all-knowing, all-seeing, all-acting, all-wise, all-loving, and eternal. Eternal, without beginning and without end, ever present and all. The Word of God, or truth, also reveals God's eternal creation as inseparable from its maker. The illumination of spiritual sense, then, is the revelation of the eternal verity and unity of God and man, including the universe. It is the dawning in human consciousness of this ever-present fact. The realization that the creation of Genesis 1, in which God is and man reflects, is the only reality, and that the so-called creation of Genesis 2, in which life begins and man becomes, is nothing but a myth. It is revealed not through material sense, but through the illumination of spiritual sense. Felt ye the power of the Word, Mrs. Eddy asks. When the light of truth dawns, it is felt. What we are talking about is not an intellectual exercise, it is a holy spiritual experience. We feel the warmth, the light and love of God's presence. This is what Moses and David and Paul and countless others experienced as they emerged into light. It was the recognition of this eternal verity, the forever unity of God and man, that transformed their natures and their lives. The dawning of truth in human consciousness is not an historical event. The power and grace of the Christ is as available to each of us as it was to these spiritual leaders in the Bible. But how do we experience it and feel the power of the Word, the grace of God? How do we emerge more fully into the light of truth? First, we must know what we are seeking. Mrs. Eddy dedicated her textbook to honest seekers for truth, not to seekers for cures of illness, but to seekers for truth. The mission of Christian Science is not to take away the sickness of the world, it is to take away the sins of the world. In other words, all unspiritual thinking. Physical healing is the effect, it's not the goal. None of these individuals, Moses, David, Paul, were looking for healing. They were looking for truth, for a better understanding of God and their relationship to Him. They were hungering for it, and that's how the light came to their consciousness, how it was able to come. They were looking in the right direction. We, too, must look in the right direction. We, too, must strive for the realization of, in the beginning, God. We always begin with God. But it can seem at times metaphysically that we're working up to God, appealing to God, or applying God to a problem. And in other traditional theologies, that's what man needs to do. He needs to get God on board somehow. And that's because those theologies are starting with a man who is separated from his Maker and susceptible to disease, aging, frailty, terror, with the mortal man of Genesis 2. But those leaders from the Bible all glimpsed the error of that belief with the realization of in the beginning God, and that's where we must begin. An early worker, Kate Buck, shared a compelling explanation of this from her own experience. She wrote, "My own healing in Christian Science is what is called slow, for I took treatment for 9 years before I received the freedom I sought from very severe attacks of suffering. I believe the logic and theory of Christian Science was fairly clear to me within a month or two, but to trust to it and make it practical took years. Looking back, I can see some reasons for delayed healing. In the first place, I believed absolutely in the reality and power of that from which I had suffered. Then, too, I wanted to be healed above all else, and this is something disastrous. Invariably, I read the textbook with the thought of being healed in my mind. I would read a powerful statement and then think, maybe that will heal me, or maybe this will heal me. And I would earnestly warn others against such practices. I thought practitioners were wasting their time when they talked so much about God, because I was not seeking a religion. I wished to be free from suffering. A few years ago, a certain healing came to pass that showed plainly how the work should be done. A man came simply asking to know more of God and his individual relationship to him. The physical was not mentioned, and that, as every practitioner knows, is extremely rare. Yet on his face was an angry, ugly-looking growth which had been there for years and about which he was very sensitive. Still, he did not refer to it. I wish I could say I did not see that thing. I cannot honestly say that, but I can say that I lost sight of it. No treatment was asked, and no treatment was given. We spent 2 hours talking about God and man, trying to realize that individual being is the one being individualized. We both felt the inspiration and uplift of that time of earnest communication with God as best we knew how. In the morning, his wife telephoned, saying that quite early she had heard him cry out, and when she ran to see what the trouble was, he simply said, "Look at me," and there was nothing on his face. That minute, I saw the way of true healing. The physical was forgotten, and I certainly did not do anything. We cannot admit the existence of something and then try to destroy it. But when we realize, even in a degree, the allness of God and man's oneness with him, there is nothing to heal. I know in my own experience, it was not until one day I laid the textbook down and said, well, whether I am ever healed or not, I am certainly finding God as I never knew him before. Then, better conditions began to be manifested. I turned to Christian Science with the thought of finding God rather than of seeking healing, and the suffering lessened and finally vanished. So this is our first step, to know what we are seeking. The realization, even in a degree, of the allness of God and man's oneness with him. The reality of, in the beginning, God. As for our next step, I would like to go back to Mrs. Eddy's statement that the Christ has appeared in all generations to all prepared to receive Christ truth. Because she introduces another concept here, and that is preparation. We must be prepared to receive truth. So, how do we do that? How do we prepare ourselves to emerge into light? Fortunately, Mrs. Eddy has given us something of a blueprint. In an article entitled The Way, she explains that we need to develop 3 qualities in order to reach the heaven-crowned summit of Christian Science. The first quality is self-knowledge. The second is humility. And the third is love. Now let's consider these. First comes self-knowledge. Learn what in thine own mentality is unlike the anointed, Mrs. Eddy says, and cast it out. A life corrected, she notes, will illumine its own atmosphere with spiritual glow and understanding. A life corrected. Isn't that what our friends from the Bible did before they were illumined with spiritual understanding? David certainly needed correction after he had Bathsheba's husband killed. The Bible says that God sent Nathan to David to show him the error of his ways. And what did David do when confronted with this criticism? He acknowledged his fault. He said, "I have sinned against the Lord." He recognized that something in his thought was less than Christ-like, and he endeavored to cast it out. Mrs. Eddy tells us self-ignorance, self-will, self-righteousness, lust, covetousness, envy, revenge are foes to grace, peace, and progress. They must be met manfully and overcome, or they will uproot all happiness. We need to ask ourselves, do I think of these characteristics as foes to and enemies to my progress, my grace, peace, and happiness? Do I guard my thought against them as I would a malicious intruder and sincerely endeavor to root them out? Or do I entertain them, humor them, minimize their presence or their impact on my practice of Christian Science? We must be truly willing to remain vigilant and root out anything that would impede our progress, if we would be prepared for the dawn of truth in our thought. The second stage of mental development, Mrs. Eddy writes, is humility. She goes on to say, one can never go up until one has gone down in his own esteem. Isn't that interesting? Never. So in order to go up, to rise out of the darkness of error into the light of truth, we must cultivate humility. Moses certainly did. Imagine what it must have been like for him to go from being raised as the son of Pharaoh, Egyptian royalty, to working as a lowly shepherd for Jethro, the priest of Midian. That must have been a tremendously humbling experience. Later, when God appeared to Moses and directed him to free the Israelites, Moses responded, "Who am I that I should go into Pharaoh and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt?" And it was only after Moses developed such profound humility that he had his revelation, his perception of God as the self-evident and eternal, I am that I am. The world's idea of meekness might be weakness instead of spiritual strength, but Mrs. Eddy pairs the word meekness with might. Meekness also goes hand in hand with obedience. Anyone who is truly meek is also willing to do whatever God asks of him, no matter what the request. Consider Paul, who literally reversed course. Imagine the humility it took for him to do that, to deliberately going from being the persecutor to the persecuted, to exchange the status and standing of a Pharisee, given great authority by the high priests, for the status of a criminal, essentially hunted and stoned and imprisoned for the sake of Christianity. Yet, when God spoke, Paul said, "Lord, what wilt thou have me to do?" And then he did it. The essence of meekness, of obedience. Cherish humility, Mrs. Eddy writes. Watch and pray without ceasing, or you will miss the way of truth and love. And we don't want to miss it. We've discussed the first two qualities that need to be developed in order to follow Jesus in the way. And now comes the third, love, in which Mrs. Eddy calls the greatest of all states and stages of being. Love that is irrespective of self, rank, or following. She's not talking about mere human love, of course, but the kind of love that Jesus so naturally expressed. A holy, unselfed, practical, healing love. For what did Jesus say? By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye have love one to another. And this is my commandment, that ye love one another as I have loved you. Now, how exactly did Jesus love others? Humbly, purely, selflessly, spiritually, without hesitation and without constraint. Consider this account from the book of Mark. It is early in his ministry, and news of Jesus' healing works had gotten out, to the point where people all around Galilee have heard about him. He has just healed Simon's mother-in-law of a fever, and now, as the sun is setting, the crowds come. Here's what happened next. At even, when the sun did set, they brought unto him all that were diseased, and them that were possessed with devils. And all the city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many that were sick of divers diseases, and cast out many devils. And in the morning, rising up a great while before day, he went out and departed into a solitary place, and there prayed. And Simon and they that were with him followed after him. And when they found him, they said, All men seek for thee. And he said unto them, Let us go into the next towns, that I may preach there also, for therefore came I forth. And he preached in their synagogues throughout all Galilee, and cast out devils. And they came to him from every corner. So here is Jesus, who had just healed all the city, clamoring for him outside his door. Quite a night's work. He gets up in the wee hours to have some time alone, to pray, to recharge. And what happens? People follow him. More clamoring. He's told, more crowds need you. And what is the master's response? All right, let's go. For therefore came I forth. In other words, that's what I'm here for. That's my purpose, to show forth the Father, to love, to teach, to heal. We see a similar kind of love expressed by Moses, David, and Paul. Moses devoted his life to leading the children of Israel out of bondage in Egypt toward the promised land, out of darkness into light. In addition to being a righteous and effective king, David wrote some of the most powerful verses ever recorded. How much selfless love did he express in writing down his psalms so that others could be blessed by his spiritual insights? And Paul, think of the love that must have motivated him to endure all that he did to bring truth to hungering humanity. As he said, now abideth faith, hope, charity. These three, but the greatest of these is charity. Mrs. Eddy concurs, divine love is the substance of Christian science, she writes, the basis of its demonstration, yea, its foundation and superstructure. The substance, the basis, the foundation, the superstructure, in other words, the bedrock. and it must be cultivated in our thought in order to demonstrate science. Unselfed love is really Christianity, isn't it? It's the demonstration of the divine principle, divine love. Have you ever considered how many times Mrs. Eddy uses the phrase, the divine principle, love, or love the divine principle? It's more than 50 times in her writings. So when she says that science will declare God aright and Christianity will demonstrate this declaration and its divine principle, isn't she saying that Christianity demonstrates love? It is the active, practical, healing expression of divine love, the life and love that Jesus so thoroughly embodied. Now this brings us back to where we started today, to those two largest words in the vocabulary of thought, Christian and science. As we've seen, the practice of the science of Christianity is twofold. We must understand the letter, the science, and we demonstrate the spirit, the Christianity. We cannot have one without the other. Our leader says, we must receive the divine principle in the understanding and live it in daily life, and unless we so do, we can no more demonstrate science than we can teach and illustrate geometry by calling a curve a straight line or a straight line a sphere. Science, the letter, the law, the understanding of truth, leading to the demonstration of love, the spirit, the gospel, Christianity. This is Christian science, and this is our church, the structure of truth and love. Now, Christian Science nursing is an integral part of our church. It is not separate and distinct from the Church of Christ scientist. It's part of the very fabric of our church, right there in our church manual. And really, doesn't the work of a Christian Science nurse exemplify the liberating truth and healing love that defines this church? Consider this testimony from a friend of mine. Early one morning a few months ago, I woke up with some internal discomfort. Within a short time, the pain had escalated to a point that it was initially alarming to me. I readily called a Christian Science practitioner for prayerful treatment. Her response was quick and immediate, and I knew strong, effective metaphysical work was going on. I live alone, and I knew it was wisdom for someone to be with me. A dear friend, a fellow Christian Science nurse, answered my call and came within a short time to my home. Though the picture was extremely aggressive, the pain at times seemed beyond what I could endure, Christian Science nursing surrounded me with such deep compassion and calm, and with crystal clear clarity of my dominion and present perfection. I felt so supported in claiming and feeling my dominion, despite what material sense testimony was trying vigorously to insist was real. My dear friend stood steadfast by my side for several hours, caring for me, nursing me with metaphysical alertness, wisdom, and tenderness. At one point, I desperately yearned for stillness, both mentally and physically, to be able to hear God's word, though I never doubted for a moment his healing presence and the efficacy of Christian Science treatment. With the unwavering support of the practitioner and the sweet and reassuring activity of the Christian Science nursing embracing me, I began to find the rest I felt so in need of. The healing came that afternoon. It was instantaneous and complete in every way. The presence of a Christian Science nurse and the ministry of Christian Science nursing I was so blessed to receive that day was clearly significant to this healing and to my ability to stand firm and fearless during this wonderful proof of God's care. Isn't that a perfect example of the mission of our church and of the power of the Word? This dear nurse held fast to her understanding of truth with crystal clear clarity of the patient's dominion and present perfection, while reflecting divine love by demonstrating deep compassion and tenderness, attending to her human needs. And what was the result? A full salvation. A patient made better in every way, not just physically. Now, what a contrast to a medical diagnosis used to patch up matter, a process that leaves the patient at best in the same place it found them, still believing they are susceptible to illness, injury, suffering. With the practice of Christ healing, we are not unchanged. Our natures are transformed, and we are made better, physically, morally, and most importantly, spiritually, because we have drawn closer to God. While Mrs. Eddy does not devote a chapter to Christian Science nursing in her writings, she does devote a chapter in Science and Health to Christian Science practice. And what is the manual's first requirement of a Christian Science nurse? A demonstrable knowledge of Christian Science practice. And then in our textbook, she says a nurse should be receptive to truth and love. Truth and love, the law and the gospel. Christian Science demands both law and gospel, Mrs. Eddy says, in order to demonstrate healing. And I have taught them both in its demonstration and with signs following. They are a unit in restoring the equipoise of mind and body and balancing man's account with his Maker. The sequence proves that strict adherence to one is inadequate to compensate for the absence of the other, since both constitute the divine law of healing. This is the example that Jesus set for us, the divinity of the Christ made manifest in the humanity of Jesus, truth made manifest in the demonstration of love. Remember Peter's declaration to Jesus, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Well, this is the truth that Jesus built his church on, the living God. And that means everything to do with church is living. Living truth, living power, living love. This is our church, the structure of truth and love. We understand truth and we live love, and healing is the effect. This is what it means to be a Christian Scientist, a follower of Jesus. But in order to do this, we must do our work. There is no other way than the way. And so, this must be our aim, to cultivate self-knowledge, humility, and love in order to be prepared to receive the light of truth, to understand the true nature of being, of God and man, and then demonstrate that understanding in active, practical, living love. To really be a follower of Christ, to emerge into light, and to not rest until we do. As Mrs. Eddy puts it, paraphrasing David, "All men shall be satisfied when they awake in his likeness, and they never should be until then." Now let's talk a moment about that word awake, because when we emerge into light, we're not becoming something different, something new, although it can feel like that, but truly, we're waking up to who we already are. That's what light does. It dispels the darkness and enables us to see what has always been present. Light doesn't create anything or even change anything. It simply illuminates reality. This means we don't have to force anything or push through anything. We only need to yield. Yield to our dominion, yield to spiritual growth, yield to a higher form of humanity. Because what appears to be transformation is really illumination. We call it healing or regeneration, but it is actually the illumination of our thought, where we perceive reality. We don't undergo a process of redemption. Redemption is simply an awakening to our original, true, forever selfhood. And that can happen in an instant. I would like to share a beautiful illustration of this from a friend of mine. And here's what she says. My husband had been struggling with emotional challenges, and I was aware that he hadn't really been himself for quite some time. But I was not prepared for the discovery that he had been unfaithful to me with one of my closest friends. I learned about the relationship when I stumbled upon a series of text messages, and what I read was incredibly upsetting. The extent to which my husband and this friend had vilified me was shocking, and I simply couldn't believe that two people who knew me so well could actually think that I was so evil. For well over a year after my husband ended the relationship and began to work with me to repair the marriage, I struggled to understand how my friend could have believed the crazy things he'd said about me while he was in the middle of a mental breakdown. I could not have felt more humiliated, and at times it was all I could do to not pack my bags and walk out the door. Then, recently, my husband was feeling quite ill and asked me to pray for him. As I was considering the scientific statement of being, I realized that I had never really paid attention to the second infinite in the phrase, all is infinite mind and its infinite manifestation. I had always thought, right, God is infinite mind, and all that exists in this infinite mind, and all that exists is this infinite mind and its creation. But this time, I was struck by the fact that the creation, the manifestation of mind, is also infinite, infinitely good. I had an image of a black night sky stretching out for infinity and thought, there can't be any holes in that, not even a pinprick of error or evil. If there were, it wouldn't be infinite. And then I saw really, really clearly that I had accepted that my husband and this friend had done something horrible to me, and that I needed to get over that something horrible. But if the manifestation of God, good, is infinite, then there is no horrible. There are no villains. And that meant these two people couldn't have done something villainous. It simply could not have happened. At that moment, I realized that the very thing I thought they'd done to me, vilification, was the same thing I'd been doing to them. I had felt justified, but in reality, there was no difference. I had been given a choice to buy into the same belief they had, that evil can be present in the midst of God's infinite manifestation of good. And that was just a lie, a mistake, in which I could choose not to accept. Instantly, I felt love wash over me. It seemed silly to think that these two people could have ever been villains. I knew who they really were, and I loved them. I shared these insights with my husband, who had been crippled by the self-recrimination he felt over the affair. The physical complaint was healed immediately, and so was our marriage. For more than a year, I had wanted to get to a place of love and forgiveness with these two, but it had felt like Mount Everest, like it would take years and years to claw my way to the top. But in the end, all it took was that brief glimpse of God's infinitely good creation, and in an instant, I was there. Now, isn't that a wonderful example of everything we've been talking about? My friend knew what she was seeking, a change in her own heart, not a change in the human condition. And she had been earnestly endeavoring to root out whatever needed to be corrected in her thought, which took great humility given the circumstances. And then, as she was expressing love for her husband, the light came, dispelling every trace of self-righteousness and transforming her thought. The result was complete redemption of the situation, physically, morally, spiritually. Now, it's important that we talk about what happens after we get this glimpse of spiritual reality, because it can be tempting to think that the moment of revelation is the ultimate, the pinnacle. But actually, it's the foundation for what comes next. It's not the peak or the end. It's the continuity of the beginning. The fact is, there is work to be done after the light of the Christ dawns in human consciousness. Look at Moses. He spent 30 years working on character issues after he glimpsed, I am that I am. Paul's light-filled revelation was followed by a time of reflection. Even Jesus spent time in the wilderness after his baptism. So what were they doing? Mrs. Eddy recounts her post-revelation experience like this. For 3 years after my discovery, I sought the solution of the problem of mind healing, searched the scriptures and read little else, kept aloof from society, and devoted time and energies to discovering a positive rule. I knew the principle of all harmonious mind action to be God, and that cures were produced in primitive Christian healing by holy, uplifting faith. But I must know the science of this healing, and I won my way to absolute conclusions through divine revelation, reason, and demonstration. Revelation, reason, and demonstration. We glimpse the truth of being, the immutable fact of, in the beginning, God. Then we reason through this fact and its implications, and this makes it our own. And in that way, we're not just quoting truth, we're living it. It becomes our character, our nature, and we demonstrate it. It's also important to note what Mrs. Eddy turned to as she reasoned her way through her discovery: the scriptures. The Bible was my only textbook, she writes. She searched it, reading little else, because the Bible is the basis, the source of Christian science. From those glorious glimpses seen by the prophets to the full glory of the Christ as presented by Jesus, the way shower, the master Christian, to the Acts of the Apostles, the Bible presents the eternal verity of, in the beginning, God. It represents the unfoldment of God and man to human consciousness. Now, unlike Moses, David, and Paul, Mrs. Eddy had no need of serious redemption. She had always read the Bible, had always been a good Christian, always had a hungering heart, and she had even healed without understanding the principle behind it. But when that moment of light came, our leader's mission was illuminated to present the final revelation of truth as promised by Jesus. This moment really marked the beginning of her life work. And she says she followed the leadings of this revelation until reason and revelation were reconciled, and afterwards the truth of Christian science was demonstrated. While no one can take the place of Jesus or Mrs. Eddy, we each have our own individual mission in the cycles of divine light. Each one of us is vital, an integral part of the revolutionary struggle against error and of the ultimate redemption of mankind. Each individual must fill his own niche in time and eternity, Mrs. Eddy says. And as we reason through our spiritual insights, that niche is revealed. Let me share a sweet story about this from my own experience. My husband and I were newly married and just starting out in the arts in Manhattan. And my husband had an odd job painting the apartment of a Christian Science teacher who had just moved to the city. We were watching our pennies, so I made a peanut butter sandwich for my husband's lunch and walked all the way across town to deliver it. And while my husband ate his sandwich, I started talking with this teacher. And when he asked what we did for a living, I told him that my husband was an actor and that I had a number of little artistic endeavors going on. And then he quoted Mrs. Eddy's statement. This divine principle of all expresses science and art throughout his creation and the immortality of man and the universe. And then he looked at me and said, "You are that art." I was still a relatively new student of Christian Science, and this statement floored me. I understood it immediately. Man is the art of creation. Now, before this, I'd thought that I was God's child, and I was creative, but art was something I produced. But now I saw, no, man is the art. And I perceived the truth of this statement in two ways. You are that art, meaning it was my identity and the identity of everyone, of all creation, but also you are that art, meaning it was a present reality forever. And that's the truth of creation, eternally. Well, the next day, my husband had an audition in our neighborhood for a summer theater job, and I went with him. After we had waited hours for his turn to audition, the director came out and said that their time was up on the room rental and no one else would be able to audition. But I was still pondering, you are that art. And before I knew it, out of my mouth came these words. You know, we live around the corner and we have a piano, so why don't we all go there and finish the auditions at our place? Well, now trust me, people don't do this. But everyone thought it was a great idea, and off we all went. I didn't make the offer for my husband's benefit. I was just so inspired with the idea of you are that art. And I saw everyone there as an expression of the art of creation, an expression that was ongoing and never ending. Well, as it turned out, my husband did get that job, and I ended up meeting someone through that experience who got me started on my own career, a career that developed and grew continuously in the subsequent years until I eventually left it to enter the full-time practice of Christian Science. So you see, what was true for Moses, David, and Paul is true for us as well. The same action of the Christ, illuminating spiritual sense, lights our pathway forward and reveals a larger purpose, a larger career. Because I saw so clearly, we are that art. And you are that art. You are that art. Creation is just vivid with life and color, creativity and music, freshness and vitality. That needs to be a part of our understanding of life and of who we already are. Creation unfolding itself as us. This creation is universal, and yet each one of us is individually unique. Each one of us has our own niche to fill in time and eternity. To think that it's an earthbound niche or career defined by time is a mistake that will limit our life work. God is in charge of our life work, and its progress is perpetual. This is the new birth going on hourly, continually. There's no beginning, there's no ending, there's no inaction or stagnation. There is only the infinite idea forever developing itself, as Mrs. Eddy tells us, broadening and rising higher and higher from a boundless basis. There is nothing, no power, no person, place, nor thing that can impede or thwart this action of the Christ. There can be no force, no entity, no circumstance able to controvert the word of God. God made all that was made, and all that he made was good. Now, that doesn't mean we won't face challenges. Life did not suddenly turn into a bed of roses for the biblical figures we've discussed, or for Mrs. Eddy, or even for Jesus. But like them, we can resist the temptation to stop working when something needs correcting, and to continue straight through until it is healed. We can look at trials and challenges as proofs of God's grace and be grateful for the opportunity they present for us to mature spiritually. Because the fact is, the same issues they struggled with, we struggle with. Moses with self-righteousness, David with pleasure in matter, Paul with theological ignorance. Haven't we all found ourselves tackling those? That's the thread that runs through the Bible all the way to us today. The story of them is the story of us. And they have given us powerful illustrations of how to work the work, of how to walk the walk, and of the results that are assured for us if we do. Spiritual illumination, transformation, continuous growth, a life work created and governed by God. Jesus said, "If ye continue in my word, then are ye my disciples indeed, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." That word, continue, is essential. Think of Mrs. Eddy's prayer for the big children. Father, Mother good, lovingly thee I seek, patient, meek, in the way thou hast, be it slow or fast, up to thee. Be it slow or fast, it doesn't matter. We won't stop being seekers for truth until we understand truth. It doesn't matter what the guy to the right of us or to the left of us is doing. It doesn't matter what our circumstances are. All that matters is that we continue in his word. That's what makes us free. And so, my friends, this is our work, our continuing walk. Like Moses, David, and Paul, we must hunger after righteousness, after a better understanding of God and man, make ourselves fit to receive this understanding through self-examination and the cultivation of humility and love. And as we perceive this truth, this light of the Christ, we must demonstrate it through the active practice of living love. This is our duty as followers of Jesus, as members of his church, and as practitioners of those two largest words in the vocabulary of thought: Christian Science. Like those who came before us, we must not rest until we awake in his likeness, so we can share this truth and this love with the world, casting out error and healing the sick. This will happen only as it is first lived by us, as we are individually transformed. Then we are ready to share it with the world, and that is what transforms the world. As both Jesus and Mrs. Eddy have told us, we are the light of the world. It is up to us to ensure that this light of divine science isn't hidden, but that it radiate and glow into noontide glory. So, let us be diligent and obedient. Let us live the love of love, alert and awake and undistracted by anything that would counteract or deter our thought or actions. And let us remember that the divine principle, love, not only works with us, but this is his intention, his very purpose. And as we walk this walk, Let us hold to this promise from Mrs. Eddy. Hungering and thirsting after a better life, we shall have it and become Christian Scientists. Learn God aright and know something of the ideal man, the real man, harmonious and eternal. This movement of thought must push on the ages. Thank you.